The pop of the toaster sounded too much like a suppressed gunshot. Janet Walker flinched, her hand instinctively dropping to her right thigh, reaching for a customized Sig Sauer P226 that hadn't been holstered there in over 3 years. Her fingers brushed against the soft, worn cotton of her sweatpants instead of cold Kydex. She closed her eyes, drawing in a long, shuddering breath, holding it for a count of 4, and releasing it for a count of 4. Box breathing, a trick learned in the dust of Fallujah, perfected in the shadows of Damascus, and now deployed in a sunlit suburban kitchen in Alexandria, Virginia. "Mom, did you burn the Pop-Tarts again?" The voice, bright and entirely untouched by the darkness of the world, shattered the lingering phantom of cordite in Janet's mind. She opened her eyes to see 8-year-old Henry standing in the doorway. He was a hurricane of mismatched colors, a neon green dinosaur t-shirt, blue jeans with a patch on the left knee, and a brightly colored backpack that looked entirely too large for his narrow shoulders. His hair, a messy mop of chestnut brown, stuck out at odd angles. A fierce, protective warmth bloomed in Janet's chest, instantly chasing away the ghosts of her past. She smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the faint, jagged scar running just beneath her left jawline, a souvenir from a close-quarters extraction gone sideways. "I caught them just in time, kiddo," Janet said, plucking the pastries from the toaster. "Are you ready for the big wilderness expedition?" Henry's eyes widened, practically vibrating with excitement. "Yes, Mr. Harrison said we might see actual peregrine falcons at the state park. And maybe even a black bear. Did you pack my binoculars? And my field guide? And the extra granola bars?" "Binoculars are in the side pocket. Field guide is in the main compartment. And I packed enough granola bars to feed a small army," Janet replied, tossing him an apple. "An army." The words slipped out effortlessly. A reflex. She had fed armies, moved with them, fought alongside them. Now, her entire unit consisted of one fragile, brilliant little boy. She poured her coffee, her gaze involuntarily sweeping the kitchen. Windows locked, blinds angled downward to prevent line of sight from the street. Doors deadbolted. Old habits didn't just die hard, they refused to die at all. For 10 years, Janet Walker had been a ghost, a Tier 1 operator in an unacknowledged special mission unit. Her job had been to infiltrate the worst places on Earth, neutralize high-value targets, and extract without leaving a footprint. She had been a predator. Now, she was just a single mother trying to navigate the terrifying minefield of third-grade PTA meetings. "You know, Mom," Henry said, his mouth half full of Pop-Tart. "You don't have to come. Tyler's mom is going, and so is Sarah's dad." Janet walked over and ruffled his hair. "And miss out on seeing a black bear? Not a chance, Hank. Besides, I promised Mr. Harrison I'd help wrangle you wild animals." The truth was, she couldn't let him go alone. Not today. A low-level anxiety had been humming in her blood for the past 48 hours. An instinctual itch that she had learned never to ignore. There was no specific threat. No chatter. No intelligence briefing. It was just the hyper-vigilance of a veteran who knew too well how fast a sunny day could turn into a bloodbath. 40 minutes later, they arrived at the parking lot of Oak Creek Elementary. The yellow school bus sat idling, a loud, diesel-belching beast waiting to swallow up 35 third graders. The air was filled with the chaotic symphony of children yelling, parents giving last-minute instructions, and the frantic blowing of a teacher's whistle. Janet moved through the crowd with an easy, practiced grace, her eyes continuously scanning. She catalogued everything. Tyler's mom, wearing heels to a nature hike. Liability. Sarah's dad, checking his phone, completely unaware of his surroundings. Bus driver, older, overweight, probably poor cardio. All right, explorers. Mr. Harrison, a young teacher with boundless enthusiasm and zero tactical awareness, clapped his hands. Let's get boarded. Buddies together. Henry grabbed his best friend Leo's hand, practically dragging the smaller boy onto the bus. Janet followed, taking a seat near the middle. It wasn't an accident. In a vehicle, the middle provided the best vantage point of both the front and rear exits, while keeping her away from the most likely points of impact in a collision. She slipped her phone into her pocket and rested her hand on her purse. Inside, hidden beneath a layer of wet wipes and emergency juice boxes, was a compact, customized Glock 43X. It was highly illegal to bring onto school property, but Janet would rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6, or worse. Watch them carry her son. The doors hissed shut. The bus lurched forward, leaving the safety of the suburban bubble behind as it merged onto the interstate, heading toward the rugged, heavily forested terrain of the Shenandoah Valley. For the first hour, the ride was agonizingly normal. The decibel level inside the bus was deafening as children sang songs, argued over Pokémon cards, and threw crumpled wrappers at each other. Janet sat quietly, her baseball cap pulled low, projecting the image of a bored, tired mother. Underneath the brim, her eyes never stopped moving. As they left the interstate and began navigating the winding, two-lane mountain roads leading up to the reserve, the cellular service dropped. Janet glanced at her phone screen. No signal. Her jaw tightened. Isolation was a tactical disadvantage. The road narrowed, flanked on one side by a steep, rocky embankment and on the other by a sheer drop into a ravine thick with pine trees. The bus groaned as it navigated a sharp hairpin turn. Then, the world stopped making sense. It didn't happen with an explosion, but with a terrifying, calculated precision. An enormous, heavily armored black SUV abruptly pulled out from a hidden logging road, cutting horizontally across the asphalt and blocking both lanes. The bus driver slammed on the brakes. The massive yellow vehicle skidded, tires screaming in protest, throwing children forward against the green vinyl seats. Henry cried out, dropping his binoculars. "Hey, what the heck are you doing?" the driver yelled, throwing the transmission into park and reaching for the door lever. "Don't open the door," Janet shouted, her voice cutting through the sudden panic of the children with military authority. She was already out of her seat, moving toward the front, but she was too late. The driver hit the pneumatic switch. The doors swung open just as four men poured out of the black SUV. They didn't look like common criminals. They moved in a diamond formation, weapons raised, sweeping their sectors. They wore unmarked black tactical gear, Kevlar vests, and balaclavas, but it was the weapons that made the blood freeze in Janet's veins. Modified HK-416 assault rifles. Military grade, highly trained. The lead man lunged onto the bus before the doors were fully open. He didn't say a word. He just brought the butt of his rifle down in a brutal arc, smashing it into the driver's temple. The older man crumpled instantly, dead or unconscious. Children began to scream, high-pitched, Terrifying shrieks of pure panic. "Quiet," the second man barked, stepping over the driver and pointing his rifle down the aisle. "Everyone shut your mouths right now, or I start putting holes in the roof." The third and fourth men boarded quickly, securing the front and pointing a weapon toward the back emergency exit. A flawless, aggressive takeover. 30 seconds, max. Janet had frozen in the aisle, 3 rows back from the front. She slouched her shoulders, widened her eyes, and let her hands tremble visibly. To the men in black, she was just a terrified soccer mom paralyzed by fear. But inside, Janet Walker had vanished. The loving mother making Pop-Tarts was gone. The operator had awakened. Her heart rate slowed, her breathing steadied, her eyes catalogued the threats with cold, mechanical precision. Target 1. Front door. Agitated. Trigger discipline is sloppy. Finger on the trigger. Target 2. Pointing down the aisle. Leader. Confident. Heavy armor plates. Target 3 and 4. Securing the rear. Spaced out. Good fields of fire. 4 heavily armed hostiles. 35 screaming children. An enclosed space with limited mobility. No backup. No comms. She felt a small, trembling hand grab the back of her shirt. She didn't need to look down to know it was Henry. He was terrified, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. If she drew her weapon now, it would be a bloodbath. The crossfire would tear through the thin metal of the bus and the small bodies trapped inside. She couldn't fight them like a soldier. Not yet. She had to fight them like a ghost. She had to dismantle them from the inside out. Silently, brutally, and completely undetected by the children. The leader of the hijackers racked the charging handle of his rifle, the metallic clack echoing above the crying kids. He pulled a satellite phone from his vest. "We have the package," he spoke into the device, his eyes scanning the terrified faces of the children. "And we have leverage." Janet slowly lowered herself back down into her seat, pulling Henry into her lap and burying his face in her chest to muffle his sobs. She stroked his hair with one hand. With the other, she unzipped the hidden compartment of her purse and wrapped her fingers around the cold, textured grip of her Glock. "I'm going to get you home, Henry," she promised silently, her eyes locking onto the back of the leader's neck, calculating the exact angle needed to sever his brainstem. "I'm going to get you all home. And these men are going to die in these woods." The heavy doors of the school bus hissed shut, sealing 35 children, a bleeding driver, and 4 heavily armed mercenaries inside a yellow steel cage. "Get him out of the seat. Move." The leader, Target 2, barked, pointing his rifle at the unconscious driver. Target 1, the jumpy operative who had breached the door, grabbed the older man by the collar of his jacket and dragged him roughly down the steps, dumping him onto the dirt shoulder of the road. Janet's stomach tightened, but she forced her breathing to remain shallow and erratic, playing the part of a terrified civilian. "He's breathing," she noted, catching the faint rise and fall of the driver's chest before the doors slammed shut again. "Concussed. Maybe a fractured skull, but alive." "Drive," the leader commanded Target 1. "Get us off this main road. Stick to the route." Target 1 holstered his weapon, vaulted into the driver's seat, and slammed the bus into gear. The massive vehicle lurched forward, leaving the paved highway and grinding onto a narrow, rutted logging trail that cut deep into the dense canopy of the Shenandoah woods. The shadows of the towering pines swallowed the bus, plunging the cabin into a dim, claustrophobic gloom. All right, listen up. The leader turned to face the children, his voice booming over the rumble of the diesel engine. The tactical mask hid his face, but his eyes, pale blue and dead as winter ice, swept over the crying kids. Nobody speaks. Nobody moves. If you have a phone, a tablet, or a smartwatch, you take it out and drop it in the aisle. Right now. If we find a device on you after this, I will drag you off this bus myself. Understood? Panic surged through the cabin. Small hands fumbled with backpacks. Devices clattered onto the ribbed rubber floor. Target 3 and Target 4 began moving down the narrow aisle from the front, their combat boots crunching over discarded juice boxes and plastic toys. They were kicking the phones into a pile, their HK-416s held at the low ready. Janet felt Henry trembling violently against her ribs. He was clutching his small, brightly colored backpack to his chest like a shield. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. Tears were streaming down his flushed cheeks. "Mom, who are they? I want to go home." Janet looked down at her son. Her heart, which had been beating with the slow, metronomic rhythm of a predator, broke for a fraction of a second. She needed him calm. She needed him quiet. Fear makes people unpredictable, and unpredictability in a hostage situation gets people killed. She cupped his face with both hands, her thumbs gently wiping away his tears. She leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear. "Henry, listen to me very carefully," Janet whispered, her voice incredibly soft, yet laced with a calm, unshakable certainty. "Do you remember the secret agent movies we watch? The ones where they had to go undercover?" Henry sniffled, nodding slowly, his wide eyes fixed on hers. "This is a test, baby. A drill," Janet lied smoothly, her eyes radiating a warm, reassuring glow. "Mr. Harrison set it up with the park rangers. These guys are actors. They're testing to see who the best secret agents are in the 3rd grade." "Actors?" Henry whispered back, a glimmer of confusion cutting through his terror. He looked at the men in black, then at the blood on the floor near the steps. But Mr. Davis was bleeding. "Fake blood. Hollywood makeup. I promise you," Janet said, not missing a beat. "But here is the most important part of the test. Henry, it's called the quiet game. The best agents in the world know how to become invisible. They don't make a sound. They don't cry. They don't draw attention. Can you play the quiet game for me?" Henry swallowed hard. The terror in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a fragile, desperate determination. He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. "I can do it," he whispered. "Good boy." Janet kissed his forehead. "Tell Leo. Whisper it. Pass it to the back." Henry leaned over the seat and whispered to his friend Leo, who was curled into a ball, sobbing silently. Janet watched the lie spread, a tiny ripple of manufactured courage passing from child to child. The crying began to subside, replaced by a tense, eerie silence, broken only by the violent shaking of the bus as it navigated the treacherous dirt road. "God forgive me," Janet thought, "but it keeps them still." Target 3 walked past her row, his eyes scanning the seats. He paused, looking at Janet. She immediately slumped her shoulders, pulling Henry closer, and let a calculated sob escape her lips. Staring at the man's boots in submissive fear, he grunted in disgust and moved on, walking all the way to the back of the bus to secure the emergency exit. Target 4 stopped halfway down the aisle, standing right next to row 15. Janet was in row 12. The bus was bouncing violently now. The logging road was unmaintained, full of deep washouts and exposed roots. Janet's tactical mind was running a million calculations a second. Target 2, leader, is at the front, facing backward, but his balance is compromised by the movement of the bus. Target 1 is driving, hands occupied. Target 4 is 3 rows behind me. Target 3 is at the very back, sitting on the cooler, looking out the rear window. They were separated. It was a marginal tactical error. But against a Tier 1 operator, a marginal error was a death sentence. She needed to thin the herd. Target 4 was the closest. Janet reached into her purse. She didn't draw the Glock. A gunshot in this enclosed space would deafen the kids, cause a stampede, and bring the other 3 mercenaries down on her instantly. She needed a silent takedown. Her fingers bypassed the firearm and wrapped around a solid, cylindrical object, a titanium tactical pen. To the untrained eye, it was just a sleek writing instrument. To Janet, its reinforced, tungsten carbide tip was a devastating close-quarters weapon. "Mom?" Henry whispered. "Keep your head down, Hank. Close your eyes and count to 100. Janet whispered back. "Mommy has to do a secret agent task." Henry squeezed his eyes shut. Janet took a deep breath. She waited for the rhythm of the road. Bump, dip, sway. She needed the environment to mask her movement. The bus hit a massive pothole. The entire chassis groaned, and the vehicle violently pitched to the right. Target 4, standing in the aisle, lost his footing. He swore, his left hand reaching out to grab the top of the seat in row 14 to steady himself. His rifle dipped. His neck was exposed. Janet moved. She exploded from her seat with terrifying speed. A blur of motion born from years of muscle memory. She didn't stand up, she stayed low, flowing backward over the top of row 13 like water. Before Target 4 could register the movement, Janet was behind him, her left hand clamped over his mouth and nose. Her fingers digging fiercely into his pressure points to prevent a scream. Simultaneously, her right hand drove the titanium pen upward, in a brutal, precise strike directly into the soft hollow at the base of his skull, the medulla oblongata. The mercenary didn't even have time to widen his eyes behind his mask. The strike instantly severed his brainstem. The lights went out immediately. No scream, no thrashing. Central nervous system shut down. He was dead before his knees buckled. Janet caught his dead weight flawlessly. She couldn't let him hit the floor. The thud would alert the others. Straining against his 200-pound bulk plus his gear, she pivoted smoothly, dragging his lifeless body into the empty seat in row 14. She propped him up against the window, pulling his baseball cap low over his tactical mask. She arranged his arms so the HK-416 rested across his lap. Concealed from the front of the bus by the high seatbacks, from the leader's vantage point at the front, Target 4 simply looked like he had taken a seat to steady himself against the bumpy ride. The entire sequence had taken less than 4 seconds. Janet slipped back over the seat into row 12 and sat down next to Henry. Her chest heaved slightly, but her hands were rock steady. She slipped the bloodied titanium pen back into her purse and wiped her fingers on the dark fabric of her sweatpants. 78, 79, 80. Henry was murmuring, his eyes still tightly shut. Janet looked toward the front of the bus. Target 2 was still barking orders at the driver. Target 3 was still looking out the back window. Neither had noticed the ghost operating in their mid-ranks. Janet's eyes went cold, locking onto the back of the leader's head. One down, she thought, her thumb brushing against the grip of her Glock. 3 to go. Welcome to the quiet game, boys. The heavy diesel engine of the school bus choked, sputtering violently before finally cutting out. The sudden, suffocating silence that filled the yellow cabin was infinitely heavier than the noise had been. Outside the dirt-caked windows, the afternoon sun had vanished, swallowed by the imposing shadow of a massive, dilapidated structure. It was an abandoned lumber mill. Its corrugated steel walls rusted to a dull, bleeding orange. The bus had been driven straight into the belly of the main warehouse. And with a grinding metallic shriek, massive sliding doors slammed shut behind them, plunging the interior into a murky, dust-choked twilight. They were off the grid, completely isolated, a perfect kill box. "All right, we're here. Target 2, the leader announced, his voice echoing off the cavernous walls of the warehouse. He unclipped a high-powered flashlight from his tactical vest, its blinding white beam slicing through the gloom of the bus. Phase 1 is complete. Nobody moves until I say so." Janet remained completely still in row 12, her arms wrapped protectively around Henry. The air inside the bus was growing stale, thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, old vinyl, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. "Assess the environment," her brain commanded, the operator programming overriding the mother's panic. "Lighting. 4. Exits. Front door open. Rear emergency door closed. Hostiles remaining. 3 active. 1 neutralized. Target 1, the driver, stood up from the wheel, stretching his shoulders and keeping his HK-416 slung low. "Marcus," the leader barked, shining his flashlight toward the back of the bus. "Get off your ass. Secure the perimeter outside the bus. Dom, start getting the little brats on their feet. Hands on their heads. Single file." Janet's blood ran cold. Marcus. That had to be target 4. The dead man currently propped up against the window in row 14. Just 2 rows behind her. "Marcus. Hey, are you deaf?" the leader yelled again, a note of irritation creeping into his voice. From the very back of the bus. "Target 3, Dom," groaned. "He's probably airsick again. I'll get him." Janet heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of Dom's combat boots advancing up the aisle from the rear. He was closing the distance. 30 feet, 20 feet. She had less than 10 seconds before Dom reached row 14. Less than 10 seconds before he touched Marcus's shoulder. Realized the man was a corpse. And screamed for backup. The moment that happened, the quiet game was over. The bullets would start flying. Janet leaned her forehead against Henry's. The little boy was shaking like a leaf in a winter storm. His eyes squeezed shut so tightly his face was entirely wrinkled. He was counting, just like she had asked him to. 112. 113. Level 2 of the game. "Hank," Janet whispered, her voice a soothing, hypnotic hum amidst the rising tension. "Keep your eyes closed, put your head between your knees, and cover your ears. The actors are going to make some loud noises now. Don't look up until I tap your shoulder twice. Promise me." "I promise, Mom," Henry whimpered, instantly curling into a tight, trembling ball, his hands clamped over his ears. Janet uncoiled her legs. The tight, cramped space between the seats was a nightmare for conventional fighting. But for a CQC, close quarters combat, specialist, it was an advantage. It restricted the enemy's movement and negated the length of their assault rifles. 15 feet. 10 feet. Dom was muttering under his breath, annoyed at his teammate. As Dom stepped parallel to row 13, just one row behind Janet, he reached his left hand out to shake the dead man's shoulder. "Come on, man, wake up." He leaned forward. His balance shifted entirely to his front foot. His neck was exposed. Janet moved. She didn't rise. She flowed beneath the eyeline of the seats like a shadow detaching itself from the floor. She lunged backward into the narrow aisle, slipping perfectly into the blind spot behind Dom's bulky tactical vest. Before Dom could even register the shift in the air, Janet struck. Her left arm snaked around his thick neck, her forearm crushing against his windpipe while her bicep locked against the side of his neck. A textbook rear naked choke. Simultaneously, her right hand shot down, grabbing the pistol grip of his slung HK-416, twisting it violently downward to trap the weapon against his own body so he couldn't raise the barrel. Dom's eyes bulged beneath his mask. He tried to gasp, to yell, to warn his leader, but the sound was trapped in his crushed larynx. He thrashed, a panicked, primal struggle, throwing his elbow backward. Janet absorbed the blow against her ribs, biting down on her lip to stifle a grunt. She locked her legs around his waist, using her entire body weight to drag him backward, off balance, pulling him down into the shadowed crevice between row 13 and 14. 5 seconds to unconsciousness, 15 seconds to brain death. She counted the terrifying rhythm in her head. Dom clawed desperately at her arm, his heavy combat boots kicking against the metal base of the seats. The dull thud-thud-thud was masked by the whimpers and cries of the children around them. Janet squeezed harder, pouring every ounce of her strength, her fear for her son, and her cold, calculated fury into her arms. The struggle lasted only 8 seconds, but in the compressed reality of combat, it felt like an eternity. Finally, the mercenary's arms dropped. His body went entirely limp, a dead weight collapsing against her. Janet didn't let go immediately. She held the choke for another 10 seconds, ensuring he wouldn't wake up, ever. She gently lowered his body to the floor, sliding him under the seats to hide him from the front of the bus. Her chest was heaving, a thin sheen of cold sweat prickling her forehead. Her ribs throbbed where he had struck her, but she pushed the pain away. Pain was just data. She didn't have time to process it. She ran her hands quickly over Dom's tactical vest. Extra magazines, a flashbang grenade, and then, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic holstered on his right thigh. She unclipped it, a Heckler & Koch USP compact 9mm pistol, and threaded onto the barrel was a cylindrical black suppressor. A grim, terrifying smile touched the corners of Janet's lips. A silencer. The universe was finally giving her a fighting chance. "Hey, Dom, Marcus, what the hell is going on back there?" The leader's voice cracked like a whip from the front of the bus. The beam of his flashlight swept erratically across the ceiling. He was losing his patience. He was getting suspicious. "Answer me. I'm going to check." "Target 1, the driver," said, racking the charging handle of his rifle. Janet checked the chamber of the USP. A brass cartridge gleamed in the dim light. A round was chambered. The safety was off. It was heavy, perfectly balanced, and felt like an old friend in her hands. She looked down at Henry, still curled in a ball, his hands tightly over his ears. honoring his promise. "I love you, kiddo," she thought. Janet Walker stood up. She didn't pop up wildly. She rose with a smooth, terrifying grace, stepping out into the center aisle. The facade of the terrified, trembling soccer mom melted away completely, replaced by the chilling, blank-faced stare of a Tier 1 operator. She raised the suppressed pistol, locking both hands around the grip, aligning the tritium night sights squarely on the chest of Target 1, who was just beginning to walk down the aisle. "Game over," Janet whispered to the empty air. And she pulled the trigger. The suppressed Heckler & Koch USP Compact didn't sound like a gun in the movies. There was no high-pitched pew. Instead, as Janet Walker squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession, the weapon let out two sharp, mechanical coughs, like a heavy-duty staple gun driving steel into wood. Thwip, thwip. Two 9mm hollow-point rounds punched through the dim air of the bus. Target 1, the driver who had been advancing down the aisle, never even had the chance to raise his rifle. The first round struck him dead center in the sternum, shattering his sternal angle and dropping his blood pressure to zero in a fraction of a second. The second round, fired a millimeter of a second later in a flawless double tap, caught him in the throat just above the collar of his Kevlar vest. He collapsed straight down, his knees buckling under him. His heavy body hit the rubber floor of the aisle with a dull, meaty thud. His HK-416 clattered against the metal seat frame. But the sound was mostly swallowed by the lingering rumbles of the bus engine cooling down. At the front of the bus, Target 2, the leader, froze. He hadn't seen the muzzle flash, thanks to the suppressor, but the heavy thud of his man hitting the deck was unmistakable. "Report," the leader barked, his voice sharp, echoing slightly in the hollow metal tube of the bus. He swept his high-powered flashlight down the aisle. The blinding white beam cut through the dusty air, illuminating the rows of seats, the tops of the children's heads, and the motionless boots of his fallen comrade. "I said report, damn it." The leader's fingers slipped inside the trigger guard of his rifle. Panic, cold and sudden, was finally bleeding into his hardened demeanor. He took a step backward, pressing his shoulders against the closed folding doors of the bus, trying to maximize his field of vision. Janet had already moved. The moment Target 1 hit the floor, she had dropped into a low crouch, sliding horizontally into the empty space of row 11. She knew the flashlight beam was coming. She let it sweep past her, the intense light missing her by inches. "He's isolated. He's cornered. He's panicking," Janet analyzed, her breathing perfectly controlled. She peeked through the narrow gap between the seatbacks. The leader was sweeping the beam frantically now, left to right, trying to find the ghost that had just dropped his man. His tactical mask covered his lower face, but his eyes were wide, darting furiously. He was wearing heavy level 4 ceramic plates. Center mass shots with a 9mm pistol would just piss him off and give away her position. She needed a headshot. Specifically, the T-box, the small area encompassing the eyes and the bridge of the nose. A shot there would instantly sever the medulla and shut down the central nervous system, preventing him from pulling the trigger in a reflexive death spasm. But shooting into a blinding flashlight beam from 40 feet away, in a dark, cramped bus full of children, was a nearly impossible shot. Make him turn the light off, her instincts whispered. Janet reached down to the floor, her fingers brushing against a discarded, brightly colored metal water bottle that one of the kids had dropped. She grabbed it. With a swift, precise flick of her wrist, she tossed the metal bottle under the seats, sending it skittering loudly toward the back of the bus. Clang, rattle, clang. The leader reacted instantly to the sound. He spun on his heel, aiming his rifle and his flashlight toward the rear emergency exit, entirely exposing his left side to Janet. "Who's back there?" he roared. It was the opening she needed. Janet popped up from behind row 11, her arms extending in a perfect isosceles stance. She ignored the darkness. She trusted her muscle memory. The alignment of her tritium sights glowing faintly green in the gloom. She found the side of his head. She exhaled smoothly. Whip. The suppressed 9mm round tore through the side of the leader's tactical helmet just below the Kevlar rim, punching directly into his temple. The high-powered flashlight in his hand instantly shattered on the floor as his body went completely rigid, then collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. The bus plunged into near-total darkness. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. The only sounds were the ragged, terrified breathing of 35 third-graders and the faint drip of blood hitting the rubber mat at the front of the bus. "Mom?" Henry's voice was a tiny, fragile thread in the dark. He was still in row 12, his hands covering his ears. "Is the loud part over?" Janet quickly saw-fed the USP pistol and slid it into the waistband of her sweatpants at the small of her back. She stepped over into row 12 and knelt beside her son, pulling him into a tight, fierce embrace. "The loud part is over, baby," she whispered, kissing the top of his messy hair. "You did so good. You are the best secret agent I've ever seen. Can I open my eyes now?" "Not yet, Hank. The game isn't finished," Janet said softly. She looked up. Mr. Harrison, the young teacher, was trembling violently in the front row, his face buried in his hands. He hadn't seen what happened. He was entirely shut down by fear. "Mr. Harrison," Janet called out, keeping her voice low, authoritative, and calm. The teacher flinched but looked back through the gloom. "Janet? Oh my God. What happened to them?" he stammered, looking at the bodies on the floor. "They're sleeping. It's part of the drill," Janet lied, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity, commanding him to play along. "Listen to me, Mr. Harrison. You are going to keep the kids in their seats. Nobody takes off their seat belts. Nobody uncovers their eyes until I come back. I had to go outside to talk to the park rangers and finish the exercise. Do you understand me?" The teacher swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He didn't believe the lie, but he believed the absolute, cold authority radiating from the suburban mother standing before him. Yes, I understand." "Good." Janet gave Henry one last squeeze. "I'll be right back. Hank, stay with Leo." Janet walked to the front of the bus. She stepped carefully over the body of the leader. She reached down, grabbing the man's tactical vest, and dragged him slightly to the side so she could access the pneumatic lever for the doors. She also stripped him of 2 spare 9mm magazines, shoving them into her pockets. She pulled the lever. The folding doors hissed open. The air inside the abandoned lumber mill was cold, smelling of ancient sawdust, damp earth, and motor oil. Janet stepped off the bus, her boots crunching softly on the concrete floor. She drew the suppressed USP again, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the vast, cavernous darkness of the warehouse. Moonlight filtered through shattered skylights high above, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. To her left, parked about 20 yards away, was the heavy black SUV that had ambushed them. Its engine was off, but the headlights were still on, casting a harsh glare against a wall of rusted machinery. She swept the perimeter. No movement, no immediate threats. Janet moved back to the front of the bus, kneeling beside the dead leader. She needed intel. A random hijacking of a school bus made zero tactical sense. There was no political leverage in a bus full of middle-class third graders. And the logistics of managing 35 hostages were a nightmare. This was a targeted operation. She unvelcroed the leader's chest rig and reached into his inner pocket. Her fingers found a ruggedized, military-grade smartphone. She pulled it out and tapped the screen. It was locked, but a notification banner glowed brightly on the lock screen. It was an encrypted text message, received just 2 minutes ago. It read, "ETA to extraction point is 15 mics. Confirm you have the Vance boy." Janet's breath hitched in her throat. The Vance boy. She looked back up at the yellow school bus. Henry's best friend. The little boy who had been holding Henry's hand when they boarded. Leo Vance. His father was Thomas Vance, the sitting United States Secretary of Defense. This wasn't a random terror attack. This was a highly coordinated, state-sponsored kidnapping. They didn't want the bus. They didn't want the driver or the teacher. They only wanted Leo. And if they were professionals, which they clearly were, they would have no use for witnesses. Once they extracted Leo, they were going to burn the bus with everyone else inside. "Not today," Janet whispered, her voice colder than the concrete beneath her feet. She checked the chamber of her pistol, her eyes turning toward the black SUV. The extraction team was coming in 15 minutes. The chaperone was about to go to war. 14 minutes. The digital clock in Janet's head was running, relentless and precise. In 14 minutes, a highly trained extraction team would breach the abandoned lumber mill, expecting to find 4 living operators, 34 disposable witnesses, and one high-value target named Leo Vance. Instead, they were going to find a ghost. Janet turned back to the bus. She stepped quickly up the stairs, the suppressed USP pistol held at the low ready. The cabin was pitch black, filled with the stifling heat of terrified bodies and the sharp smell of fear. "Mr. Harrison," Janet hissed into the darkness. "I'm here," the young teacher whispered back. His voice was shaking so hard his teeth audibly chattered. "Listen to me, I don't have time to explain. But the men who did this aren't acting. And more are coming," Janet said, stripping away the secret agent lie for the adult in the room. She reached into her waistband, pulled out a spare 9mm Glock 43X from her purse, her personal carry weapon, and shoved it blindly into Harrison's trembling hands. He gasped, nearly dropping the cold steel. "Janet, I can't." "You can, and you will." She cut him off, her tone leaving zero room for debate. "Keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to shoot. I am going to close these doors. You will lock the pneumatic lever from the inside. You will make sure every single child is on the floor, under the level of the windows. If anyone tries to pry these doors open, and it is not me, you point that gun at their chest and you pull the trigger until it clicks empty. Do you understand?" There was a long pause. Janet could hear him swallowing hard. Finally, he spoke, his voice dropping an octave, finding a fragile anchor of courage. "I understand." "Good, Henry?" "Mom?" The small voice came from row 12. Keep playing the game, my brave boy. I love you. Love you too, he whispered. Janet stepped backward off the bus. Lock it, she commanded. The folding doors hissed shut with a metallic clank, and she heard the heavy lock engage from the inside. 13 minutes. She turned her attention to the black SUV parked 20 yards away. Moving with fluid, silent speed, she crossed the concrete floor, her eyes scanning the shadows. She opened the rear liftgate of the SUV. The dome light clicked on, revealing a tactical treasure trove. There were 2 Pelican cases strapped to the floorboards. Janet popped the latches. The first case held spare HK-416 magazines, flashbangs, and 2 M67 fragmentation grenades. The second case was what made her cold heart skip a beat: 4 blocks of C4 plastic explosive, blasting caps, and a remote detonator. They had brought breaching charges. They were planning to blow the bus once they had Leo. A cold, blinding rage flared in Janet's chest, hot enough to melt steel. She took a deep breath, boxing the emotion, pushing it down into the dark place where she kept the rest of her demons. She didn't need anger. She needed focus. She grabbed the explosives, the grenades, and 3 spare rifle magazines. Stuffing them into an empty tactical dump pouch she stripped from the dead driver. She grabbed one of the HK-416 assault rifles, checked the optics, and slung it across her back. 10 minutes. Janet stood in the center of the massive warehouse, her eyes mapping the kill zone. The abandoned lumber mill was a cavernous space, supported by thick steel I-beams. To the north were the massive, corrugated steel sliding doors, the only way a vehicle could enter. The fatal funnel. To the east, a rusted metal catwalk ran along the second story, overlooking the entire factory floor. Below the catwalk sat massive, rusted circular saws and conveyor belts, buried under years of accumulated wood dust. Wood dust. Janet knelt down, running her fingers across the floor. The sawdust was inches thick in some places, bone dry from years of abandonment. To a layman, it was dirt. To a demolition expert, fine. Airborne particulate matter was highly combustible. If ignited under the right pressure, it created a thermobaric explosion, a vacuum bomb. She moved fast. She took 2 blocks of C4 and molded them to the main load-bearing I-beam right next to the massive sliding doors. She inserted the blasting caps, wiring them to a tripwire strung ankle-high across the entrance. When the extraction team breached the doors and rushed in, the first man through would trip the wire. The explosion wouldn't just kill the point man. It would drop a massive section of the rusted roof directly onto the entrance, blocking their escape and cutting their team in half. 6 minutes. Janet moved to the center of the room, near the heaviest accumulation of sawdust. She took the 3rd block of C4, molding it to the side of an old, rusted oil drum she had dragged from the corner. She didn't wire this one to a tripwire. She inserted a remote receiver. This was her manual override. 3 minutes. She climbed the rusted iron ladder to the 2nd-story catwalk, her boots making no sound. The vantage point was perfect. She was 20 feet in the air, cloaked in complete darkness, looking down at the illuminated kill zone below. She unslung the HK-416. Resting the barrel on the rusted handrail, her finger resting gently alongside the trigger guard. She pulled the remote detonator from her pocket, wrapping her left hand around the small plastic device. Her thumb hovered over the red button. 1 minute. Silence hung in the warehouse. Heavy and suffocating. Janet's breathing slowed to a rhythmic, meditative crawl. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. She wasn't a mother worrying about PTA meetings anymore. She wasn't a soccer mom packing granola bars. She was the chaperone, and the wolves were at the door. Then, she heard it. The low, guttural growl of heavy diesel engines approaching on the dirt road outside. The sound of tires crunching over gravel. The engines idled, then cut out. Through the narrow cracks in the corrugated steel doors, high-intensity LED headlights pierced the gloom, casting long, fractured beams across the dusty floor of the warehouse. Car doors opened and closed with quiet, professional precision. Click, clack, the distinct sound of rifle bolts being racked. Suppressed weapons. Boots crunching on the gravel directly outside the main doors. Alpha Team, in position. A muffled voice came through the thick steel. Breaching in 3, 2, 1. The massive sliding doors groaned loudly as they were violently shoved along their rusted tracks. The gap widened, letting the pale moonlight spill into the dark warehouse. 3 figures moved into the opening. Silhouettes against the night, moving in a flawless, tight tactical diamond formation. Night vision goggles strapped to their helmets. Lasers cutting through the dusty air. They stepped into the fatal funnel. High above on the catwalk, cloaked in shadow, Janet Walker smiled, a terrifying, humorless expression. The pointman's boot hit the tripwire. The taut, nearly invisible filament of the tripwire snapped against the pointman's combat boot. For a microsecond, the universe held its breath. Then, the blasting cap sent an electrical spark into the block of military-grade C4 molded perfectly against the rusted steel I-beam. The explosion didn't sound like a boom. It sounded like the sky ripping in half. A blinding sphere of orange and white fire vaporized the base of the load-bearing column. The concussive shockwave hit first. A physical wall of pressure that picked up the lead operator and threw him backward like a discarded rag doll. His Kevlar armor was useless against the sheer kinetic force that instantly liquefied his internal organs. Above them, the compromised steel structure shrieked in agony. 2 tons of rusted corrugated roofing and heavy support beams detached from the ceiling and slammed down into the fatal funnel. The falling debris crushed the second man in the diamond formation instantly, burying him under a mountain of jagged metal and concrete, effectively sealing the main entrance. But Janet wasn't done. The initial shockwave had done exactly what she calculated. It had violently disturbed the thick layers of ancient, bone-dry sawdust covering the warehouse floor, thrown millions of highly combustible particles into the air. It created a thick, suspended cloud of fuel. From her perch on the catwalk, coughing through the rising dust, Janet's thumb slammed down on the red button of the remote detonator. Click. The second block of C4, attached to the oil drum in the center of the room, detonated. The explosion ignited the suspended sawdust cloud. A thermobaric reaction, a terrifying vacuum bomb effect, rolled through the front half of the lumber mill. A secondary shockwave of pure, scorching heat expanded outward, consuming all the oxygen in its path. A wall of fire briefly illuminated the entire cavernous space, casting monstrous, flickering shadows against the walls. 2 more operators who had just stepped through the gap before the roof collapsed were caught in the edge of the fireball. One went down screaming, his tactical gear melting into his skin. The other, the team leader of this breach element, was thrown hard against a rusted conveyor belt, his night vision goggles shattering upon impact. 4 down in 3 seconds. Janet's mind registered the kill count with cold, mechanical efficiency, but she knew a Tier 1 team didn't operate with just 4 men. There was a support element outside. Breach failed. I repeat, breach failed. We have mass casualties. The surviving team leader inside roared into his comms, scrambling behind the thick steel frame of the conveyor belt. He blindly raised his suppressed HK-416, firing a rapid burst up toward the catwalk. The rounds sparked against the rusted iron railing inches from Janet's face, showering her with hot metal flakes. They're elite. They adapted instantly, she noted, ducking low. Ordinary thugs would have panicked and run. These men were already establishing a base of fire and identifying her elevated position. Janet slung her rifle over her back and pulled a flashbang grenade from her dump pouch. She pulled the pin, cooked it for 1 second, and tossed it over the railing. Flash out, she muttered to herself. Bang! A blinding strobe of light and a deafening 170 decibel crack disoriented the survivor below. Before the echoing ringing faded, Janet vaulted over the railing. She didn't take the ladder, that was a choke point. Instead, she dropped 15 feet straight down, landing perfectly on the sloped rubber belt of a dormant wood chipper machine. She rolled to absorb the momentum, dissolving instantly into the dense shadows on the ground floor. Where is she? Talk to me. Echo actual. A new voice barked from outside the collapsed doors. It was amplified, likely coming through a vehicle's PA system or a heavy comms unit. We are bringing the cutters. Hold your position. Janet crouched behind a stack of rotting timber, her suppressed USP pistol drawn. She regulated her breathing, wiping a smear of blood and soot from her cheek. Her ribs throbbed violently from her earlier fight on the bus, but the adrenaline masked the worst of the pain. She was on the ground floor now, in the labyrinth of massive, rusted machinery. This was her element. The cat-and-mouse game had begun. She heard the crunch of broken glass and the heavy, methodical footsteps of the surviving operator moving through the smoke. He was limping, but his weapon was up, sweeping his sectors. He had flipped his shattered night vision goggles up and was using a high-lumen weapon light to slice through the lingering dust. Sweep right, sweep left, step. He was moving with textbook precision. Janet picked up a fist-sized chunk of concrete debris. She tossed it over the operator's head, aiming for a hollow metal drainage pipe 20 yards away. Clang! The operator spun toward the noise, his flashlight beam instantly tracking to the pipe. His back was entirely exposed to the stack of timber. Janet stepped out from the shadows. She didn't run, she glided. She raised the USP, aligned the glowing green sights with the small gap in the heavy armor plates beneath his armpit, and squeezed the trigger. Fwhip, fwhip. 2 rounds bypassed the ceramic plates entirely, tearing through his ribs and shredding his heart and lungs. He gasped, dropping his rifle, and collapsed face first into the sawdust. Total silence returned to the interior of the warehouse, save for the crackle of a small fire burning near the collapsed entrance. Janet moved quickly to the dead man, stripping him of his spare magazines and a combat knife. She keyed his radio, pressing the earpiece against her ear. Status? Echo 2. What is your status? The commander outside demanded. The sound of heavy plasma cutters and circular saws began to whine from the other side of the corrugated steel doors. They were cutting their way in. Janet pressed the transmit button. She didn't disguise her voice. She let the raw, icy calm of a mother protecting her child bleed through the radio frequency. Echo 2 is dead, Janet said, her voice a terrifying whisper cutting through the static. They're all dead. If you cut through that door, you're next. Get in your trucks, leave the woods, and I will let you live. There was a long, chilling pause on the radio. The sound of the saws outside suddenly stopped. A low, dark chuckle echoed through the earpiece. Well, you aren't just a chaperone, are you? You're a professional. I respect that, but you're trapped in a box with 30 kids. Sweetheart. And I have 10 men out here with thermal optics and enough firepower to level that building. We are coming for the Vance boy. Surrender him, and you and your son can walk away. Janet's eyes flicked back toward the yellow school bus hidden deep in the shadows of the warehouse. She thought of Henry, curled in a ball, trusting her to win the game. You're not getting on that bus, Janet replied, her finger tightening on the grip of her pistol. And you're not leaving these woods. She crushed the radio earpiece under her boot. The whining scream of the plasma cutters outside started up again, twice as loud. Sparks began to shower through the heavy steel doors. They were coming through, and this time, they knew exactly what they were dealing with. A shower of white-hot slag cascaded to the concrete floor, illuminating the darkness with a harsh, sputtering glare. The agonizing, high-pitched whine of the plasma cutters outside was deafening. A mechanical predator gnawing its way through the final layers of the corrugated steel doors. 2 minutes until breach. Janet moved away from the main entrance, retreating deeper into the maze of the abandoned lumber mill. Her mind raced, running through the tactical calculus of the incoming threat. Forward-looking infrared, FLIR, or thermal optics didn't see light, they saw heat. In the cool, damp air of the warehouse, her 98.6-degree body would glow on their monitors like a radioactive beacon. She couldn't hide in the shadows anymore. The shadows were dead space to a thermal scope. She needed to mask her heat signature. Or better yet, blind them with it. Her eyes swept the environment. The thermobaric explosion had left scattered, localized fires burning across the front sector of the mill, smoldering stacks of timber and blazing puddles of hydraulic fluid. It was a start, but it wasn't enough to hide her completely. She spotted a heavily rusted welding station tucked beneath the second-story catwalk. Draped over a steel worktable was exactly what she needed, a thick, industrial welding blanket made of woven fiberglass and coated in fire-retardant silicone. It was designed to withstand thousands of degrees of direct heat and flying molten metal, which meant it would act as a perfect insulator, trapping her body heat inside and rendering her invisible to thermal imaging. Janet grabbed the heavy blanket, throwing it over her shoulders like a crude, dusty cloak. It was stiflingly hot, heavy, and smelled of ancient ozone and grease. But it was a shield. Crack! The sound of massive steel hinges failing echoed through the cavernous space. Cutters away, pushing in, a voice barked from the outside. A heavy armored vehicle, a Bearcat tactical rescue vehicle, painted matte black, rammed the weakened doors. The steel groaned, buckled, and violently collapsed inward, throwing a cloud of dust and smoke into the air. Through the dust, 4 new operators advanced. They moved flawlessly, a synchronized unit flowing into the room. Their suppressed HK-416s shouldered tight. Attached to their helmets were dual-tube panoramic night vision goggles. And mounted on their rifles were advanced thermal clip-ons. Janet was crouched 30 yards away, nestled between two massive, rusted circular saws. She pulled the thick welding blanket entirely over her head and body, curling into a tight ball against the cold iron of the machinery. Underneath the heavy fabric, sweat began to pour down her face, stinging her eyes. She gripped the suppressed USP 9mm in her right hand and a serrated combat knife in her left. Through a tiny, quarter-inch fold in the blanket, she watched them. Spread out. Two-man elements. Check your corners. Echo Actual commanded over their comms. His voice sharp and disciplined. He wasn't with them, he was managing the battle space from the command vehicle outside. Target is a highly trained female operator. Do not underestimate her. Thermals on. The four men fanned out. Two moved toward the catwalk stairs, sweeping the upper level. The other two advanced directly into the labyrinth of ground floor machinery. One of the ground operators, call sign Bravo 1, stepped within 10 feet of Janet's position. Through his thermal scope, the burning piles of timber glowed blindingly white, creating a phenomenon known as thermal washout, overloading the sensor and degrading the image quality around the flames. He swept his rifle past the rusted circular saws. Where Janet crouched, his scope showed nothing but the ambient, cool blue temperature of the old fiberglass welding blanket blending perfectly with the cold steel behind it. No body heat, no heartbeat, just debris. Ground floor clear so far. Bravo 1 whispered into his boom mic, stepping past her hiding spot, his back now fully exposed to her. Janet threw off the blanket. She didn't shoot. A gunshot, even suppressed, would instantly give away her exact coordinates to the other three men. She needed absolute silence. She lunged forward, closing the 10-foot gap in two silent, predatory strides. Her left arm shot out, the serrated combat knife biting deep into the soft, unarmored gap at the back of Bravo 1's knee, the popliteal artery. The operator buckled instantly, his leg giving out as the tendon was severed. Before a scream could tear from his throat, Janet was already behind him, her right arm wrapping around his face, her gloved hand clamping brutally over his mouth and nose. She yanked him backward, driving her knee into his spine to break his posture. With her left hand, she pulled the knife from his leg and drove it upward, sliding the blade cleanly under the bottom rim of his Kevlar helmet and directly into the base of his skull. A sharp gasp escaped his nose against her palm, his body stiffening violently before going entirely limp. Janet lowered his 220-pound frame to the floor without making a sound. She carefully unclipped his radio from his chest rig and clicked the transmit button twice. Click click, a standard tactical signal for moving. Copy. Bravo 1, his partner, Bravo 2, replied over the net, completely unaware that he was now hunting alone. Bravo 2 was 20 yards away, inspecting the charred remains of the tripwire explosion. He was isolated. Janet wiped her bloody knife on her sweatpants and raised the suppressed USP. She took a deep, steadying breath, pushing through the agonizing throbbing in her ribs. She moved laterally through the shadows, keeping the burning timber between herself and Bravo 2 to mask her approach. She needed to drop him instantly. The pelvic girdle, the structural anchor of the human body. Heavy armor plates covered the chest and back, but the pelvis was usually exposed. shatter the pelvis, and the target immediately drops, effectively immobile and in agonizing shock. She lined up the tritium sights. Thwip! The 9mm hollow point round shattered Bravo 2's right hip bone. He collapsed with a muffled grunt of pain, his rifle clattering against a steel beam. Before he could process what had happened, Janet stepped out of the smoke. Standing directly over him, he looked up, his thermal scope useless at point-blank range, seeing only the cold, unyielding silhouette of the chaperone. Thwip! A second round to the T-box ended his suffering. Bravo element, sitrep. Echo Actual's voice crackled through the stolen radio on Janet's hip. The silence stretched on for 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Charlie element. Echo Actual snapped, his voice tight with rising fury. Hold your advance on the catwalk. Bravo element is down. She's ghosting you. Switch from thermals to white light. Burn the shadows. Suddenly, the 2 operators on the second-story catwalk switched off their night vision and clicked on their weapon-mounted flashlights. 2 blinding beams of high-lumen LED light sliced down through the darkness, illuminating the dusty air and pinning Janet exactly where she stood over the dead body of Bravo 2. Target acquired. Ground floor. Sector 3, one of the operators yelled. Fully automatic gunfire erupted from the catwalk. Suppressed 5.56mm rounds chewed through the concrete floor, kicking up geysers of dust and stone just inches from Janet's boots. She dove hard to her right, rolling violently behind the thick steel treads of an abandoned forklift as bullets sparked and pinged against the heavy metal shield. Her cover was blown. The element of surprise was gone. Pin her down. Echo Actual roared over the comms. I'm sending the rest of the team in. And somebody get to that damn yellow bus. If we can't find the Vance boy, we burn it with the rest of them inside. Behind the forklift, breathing heavily, Janet ejected the partially empty magazine from her USP and slammed a fresh one home. The tactical game of hide and seek was over. The enemy was shifting their focus to the children. She looked toward the back of the warehouse, where the faint yellow outline of the school bus sat in the gloom. Inside, Henry and 33 other kids were curled on the floor, terrified, relying on a trembling teacher with a handgun. Janet's eyes darkened, all traces of humanity vanishing, replaced by the pure, unleashed wrath of a mother pushed to the edge. "You want a war?" she whispered to the shower of sparks falling around her. "Let's have a war." Inside the yellow school bus, the air was suffocating. It smelled of spilled apple juice, stale diesel, and the sharp, undeniable pheromones of human terror. 24-year-old Paul Harrison had never held a real gun before today. Now, the compact frame of Janet Walker's Glock 43X felt like a block of solid lead in his trembling, sweat-slicked hands. He knelt at the front of the bus, his back pressed agonizingly against the driver's side console, staring at the closed pneumatic doors. Outside, the warehouse had descended into a literal war zone. The muffled, rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire was horrifying enough, but the sudden, sustained roar of fully automatic 5.56mm rifles echoing off the corrugated steel walls made the children scream. The quiet game was fracturing. "Mr. Harrison?" Henry Walker's voice drifted up from row 12. The little boy was no longer counting. He had crawled out from under the seat and was kneeling in the aisle, his arms wrapped protectively around a sobbing Leo Vance. "Is my mom okay? She promised she'd be right back." Harrison swallowed the lump of pure panic lodged in his throat. He looked at Henry, seeing the fierce, desperate hope in the kid's eyes that looked exactly like his mother's. She's finishing the drill. Henry. Harrison lied, his voice cracking violently. Get back down, everyone. Heads on the floor, now. Suddenly, heavy combat boots crunched on the broken glass right outside the bus. Harrison stopped breathing. Two blinding beams of white light stabbed through the dirty glass of the folding doors, sweeping over the empty driver's seat and illuminating Harrison's pale, terrified face. Got the transport, a muffled voice yelled from outside. Doors are locked from the inside. Bring the pry bar. If they don't open up, we thermite the engine block and smoke 'em out. If anyone tries to pry these doors open, and it is not me, you point that gun at their chest and you pull the trigger. Janet's cold, absolute command echoed in Harrison's mind. A heavy steel crowbar jammed into the rubber seal between the two folding doors. The metal shrieked in protest as the mercenary outside leaned his weight into it. The doors buckled, a 2-inch gap appearing between them. Harrison raised the Glock. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely align the sights. He aimed at the dark gap where the crowbar was wedged. He closed his eyes. And he pulled the trigger. Bang, bang, bang. The unsuppressed 9mm gunshots inside the enclosed metal tube of the bus were deafening. Children shrieked in absolute terror. The glass of the folding doors shattered outward in a spray of razor-sharp diamonds. Outside, the mercenary swore violently, dropping the crowbar and stumbling back. Harrison hadn't hit him, but the sheer shock of return fire from a school bus made the operators hesitate. Contact. We are taking fire from the bus. The mercenary yelled into his radio, raising his HK-416 to stitch the side of the vehicle with armor-piercing rounds. But he never got the chance. 70 yards away, pinned behind the heavy steel chassis of the forklift, Janet heard the distinctive, ear-splitting crack of her own Glock 43X. Harrison. The sound flipped a switch deep inside Janet's cerebral cortex. The calculated, cold-blooded operator vanished. What replaced her was something older, primal, and infinitely more dangerous. A mother who realized the wolves were touching the nursery door. My turn, Janet snarled. The two mercenaries on the catwalk above her were still pouring suppressing fire down on the forklift, chewing away the concrete around her boots. Janet reached into the dump pouch at her waist. Her fingers bypassed the spare magazines and wrapped around the cold, textured steel of an M67 fragmentation grenade. She pulled the pin, holding the spoon down. She didn't have a clear throwing lane to the catwalk due to the overhanging machinery. She needed to bank it. Janet visualized the geometry of the rusted steel I-beams above her. She stepped out from the right side of the forklift, completely exposing herself to the blinding flashlights above. There she is. Drop her. Charlie 1 yelled from the catwalk. Bullets chewed the air around her, one sparking off the forklift's roll cage and slicing a shallow, bleeding groove across her left bicep. Janet didn't even flinch. She hurled the M67 upward with a devastating, major league fast pitch. The olive-drab sphere flew through the dust, striking a heavy steel crossbeam 10 feet above the catwalk. It ricocheted perfectly downward, landing with a heavy clunk directly onto the rusted metal grating between the two operators. Grenade. The explosion was catastrophic. The M67 detonated, sending thousands of lethal steel fragments ripping through the air at supersonic speeds. The rusted catwalk buckled under the blast wave, groaning before collapsing entirely, sending both mercenaries and a ton of twisted metal crashing down into the sawdust 30 feet below. Janet didn't stay to watch them fall. She had already unslung the captured HK-416 assault rifle from her back. She dropped the heavy, stifling welding blanket. She was no longer a ghost. She was a reaper. She sprinted out of the smoke, moving with terrifying, fluid speed across the open floor of the warehouse, cutting a direct angle toward the school bus. The two mercenaries who had been trying to pry the bus doors open spun around at the sound of the catwalk exploding. Through the thick dust, they saw a female figure charging them, moving faster than any operator they had ever encountered. "Hostile in the open," one yelled, raising his rifle. Janet didn't slow down. She raised the HK-416 to her shoulder without breaking stride. She didn't rely on sights, she relied on a decade of muscle memory and the sheer, burning fury in her veins. She squeezed the trigger, unleashing a controlled, 3-round burst. The 5.56 mm rounds caught the first mercenary dead in the chest, the kinetic energy shattering his ceramic plate and throwing him backward into the side of the yellow bus. Before his partner could track his laser sight onto Janet, she smoothly transitioned targets. Pop, pop, pop. The second mercenary took 2 rounds to the throat and 1 to the tactical mask. He dropped instantly, his blood spraying across the broken glass of the bus doors. Janet slid to a halt just feet from the shattered doors. Her breathing was heavy, ragged. Her left arm was bleeding freely from the grazing shot, the crimson soaking into the gray fabric of her sweatpants. She stepped over the bodies, grabbing the mangled metal of the folding doors, and ripped them apart with strength she didn't know she possessed. Inside, Mr. Harrison was still kneeling, the Glock pointed empty at the doorway. The slide locked back. He had fired the entire magazine blindly. He was hyperventilating, tears streaming down his face. Behind him, 35 children were screaming, a chaotic symphony of pure terror. "Harrison!" Janet yelled, stepping into the bus. The teacher jumped, swinging the empty gun toward her. When he saw it was Janet, covered in dust, soot, and blood, holding a military assault rifle, he dropped the pistol and collapsed against the steering column, sobbing uncontrollably. I shot at them. I tried. Janet. You did perfectly. Paul, you held the line," Janet said, her voice dropping instantly from the roar of a soldier to the soothing cadence of a mother. She moved quickly down the aisle. "Henry." A small figure launched itself from the floor of row 12, colliding with her legs. "Mommy." Janet dropped to one knee, ignoring the screaming pain in her ribs, and buried her face in her son's neck. She held him so tightly she could feel his rapid, bird-like heartbeat thumping against her chest. "I've got you, Hank. I've got you." "Are the actors gone?" Henry sobbed, burying his face in her shoulder. "Almost, baby, almost," she lied softly, kissing his forehead. Suddenly, the heavy, metallic voice of Echo Actual boomed through the warehouse, amplified by the PA system of the black Bearcat armored vehicle outside the collapsed doors. "Well played, chaperone. You took out my assault teams. But you're out of time. And you're out of exits." The heavy growl of the Bearcat's engine revved. The massive armored truck smashed through the remaining wreckage of the main doors, its headlights blindingly bright. rolling directly into the center of the warehouse. Mounted on the roof hatch of the vehicle was not a sniper. And not a rifle. It was a heavy, belt-fed M2.50 caliber machine gun. And it was pointed directly at the thin, aluminum skin of the school bus. "Bring me Leo Vance right now." Echo Actual's voice echoed through the PA. Cold and final. "Or I turn that yellow bus into a cheese grater." A .50 caliber machine gun doesn't just kill you. It dismembers you. It turns engine blocks into flying shrapnel and human beings into red mist. Against the thin, aluminum skin of a yellow school bus. It was an absolute death sentence. Janet knew this with cold, terrifying certainty. "I'm giving you 10 seconds. Chaperone." Echo Actual's voice boomed from the Bearcat's PA system, vibrating the broken glass on the floor. "Send the Vance boy out. Or I pull the trigger and let God sort out the third grade." 10. "Mom," Henry whimpered, his small hands grabbing the blood-stained fabric of her sweatpants. "Don't leave us." Janet knelt, her eyes burning with an intensity that frightened even herself. She looked at Paul Harrison, who was pale as a ghost, clutching the empty Glock. "Paul, get them all to the very back of the bus. Pack them tight against the rear emergency exit door. Do not open it until I say so." Janet commanded, her voice a low, urgent hiss. She pulled the 2 remaining blocks of C4 plastic explosive and the blasting caps from her dump pouch. 9. The PA system echoed. "What are you going to do?" Harrison breathed, his eyes wide. "I'm going to kill the biggest monster in the room," Janet said. She kissed Henry's forehead one last time. "Close your eyes. Hank, cover your ears." Janet didn't go out the front door. She moved to the driver's side window, which had been blown out during the earlier firefight. 8. 7. She slipped through the jagged window frame like a shadow, dropping silently onto the concrete floor on the blind side of the bus. The massive Bearcat was parked 30 yards away, its headlights blindingly bright, illuminating the front of the bus. The gunner in the roof turret was heavily armored, his hands gripping the spade grips of the M2 Browning machine gun. 6. Janet needed a distraction, a massive one. She looked to her left. The abandoned, rusted forklift she had used as cover earlier was sitting 20 feet away, its engine still idling with a low, rough rumble. She sprinted to the forklift. Keeping low, she reached into the open cabin, slammed the heavy transmission lever into drive, and grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the floorboard. She jammed the wrench down hard onto the accelerator pedal, wedging it against the steering column. 5. 4. The forklift lurched forward with a violent metallic screech. It rolled out from the shadows, accelerating directly into the blinding headlights of the Bearcat, right into the center of the kill zone. "Target moving, left side," the gunner in the turret yelled, tracking the heavy machinery. "Light it up," Echo Actual roared. The .50 caliber machine gun erupted. The sound was apocalyptic. The muzzle flashes were 2-foot-long spears of blinding fire. The massive, armor-piercing rounds slammed into the forklift, literally tearing it to pieces. Heavy steel plates shattered. The tires exploded. The engine block cracked open, spraying thick black oil and sparks into the air as the machine was reduced to twisted, smoking scrap metal in less than 3 seconds. But the forklift had done its job. It had drawn the gunner's eyes. The blinding muzzle flash had ruined his night vision, and the deafening roar of the gun masked the sound of Janet's approach. While the gunner was firing left, Janet sprinted right, ignoring the agonizing, burning pain in her ribs and her bleeding arm. She closed the 30-yard gap in a dead sprint. She didn't run like a mother, she ran like a Tier 1 predator closing in for the kill. She reached the passenger side of the matte black Bearcat just as the heavy machine gun spun down. She leapt, her boots finding traction on the heavy steel wheel well. She vaulted upward, grabbing the thick metal grab handle near the roof, and pulled herself up onto the top of the armored vehicle. The gunner was still looking forward through the smoke of the destroyed forklift, his hands on the .50 calories. Janet didn't hesitate. She drew her serrated combat knife, lunged forward, and drove the blade brutally into the soft gap between his Kevlar collar and his helmet. The gunner gasped, a wet, choking sound, and slumped forward over the heavy weapon. Janet grabbed his tactical vest and violently hurled his lifeless body out of the turret, sending him crashing down onto the concrete below. "Gunner down, we have a breach on the roof," the driver yelled from inside the armored cabin. Echo Actual was in the passenger seat. He drew his sidearm and aimed it up at the open turret hatch. But Janet wasn't going to stick her head inside. She took the block of C4, already wired with a blasting cap and a 3-second fuse. She armed it, dropped the gray block of explosive directly through the open hatch into the armored cabin, and slammed the heavy steel hatch shut, locking it from the outside. "Fire in the hole," Janet whispered. She dove off the roof of the Bearcat, hitting the concrete and rolling hard behind a massive concrete piling just as the fuse ran out. The explosion inside the enclosed, heavily armored cabin of the Bearcat was devastating. Because the vehicle was designed to withstand blasts from the outside, the thick armor trapped the concussive force of the C4 inside. The windows instantly blew out in a shower of pulverized, glowing glass. The heavy steel doors buckled outward. A thick, horrific cloud of black smoke and fire billowed from the roof hatch. The engine died with a pathetic, grinding choke. Silence, absolute and profound, finally descended upon the abandoned lumber mill. Janet leaned against the cold concrete piling, her chest heaving, her left arm dripping blood onto the dusty floor. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine. She slowly stood up, gripping her USP pistol, and walked back toward the yellow school bus. Through the shattered windows, she could see 35 small heads slowly popping up from the floorboards, their eyes wide with disbelief. She had done it. She had killed them all. Suddenly, from the distance, cutting through the eerie silence of the Shenandoah woods, came a new sound. Woo woo woo. Police sirens, dozens of them, helicopters thumping in the night sky. The real cavalry had finally arrived. Janet holstered her pistol. She walked to the shattered doors of the bus and climbed the steps. Mr. Harrison was sitting on the floor, staring at her as if she were a literal archangel of death. Henry uncurled himself from Leo Vance, his face covered in soot and tears. He ran down the aisle and threw his arms around his mother's waist. "Mom," he cried, burying his face in her shirt. "Did you win the game?" Janet Walker fell to her knees, wrapping both arms around her son, burying her face in his messy brown hair. The cold, mechanical operator finally shut down, and the mother returned. "Yeah, Hank," Janet whispered, tears finally breaking through her stoic facade, mixing with the dirt and blood on her face. "Mommy won the game. We're going home." The Shenandoah woods were no longer dark. They were painted in the frantic strobe light rhythm of 100 flashing red and blue sirens. FBI Hostage Rescue Team, HRT, operators. Clad in heavy tactical gear. Moved through the tree line with surgical precision. They had been briefed on a mass casualty hostage situation involving highly trained mercenaries and the son of the United States Secretary of Defense. They expected a bloodbath. They expected a grueling, hours-long siege. Breaching the main structure, the HRT team leader murmured into his comms, stepping carefully over the mangled, smoking wreckage of the collapsed corrugated doors. His rifle was raised, laser sight cutting through the lingering dust and thermobaric smoke. Keep your spacing, watch your corners. But as the tactical team pushed deeper into the cavernous space of the abandoned lumber mill, their weapons slowly lowered. Command, this is Alpha Lead. The team leader spoke again, his voice losing its hardened edge, replaced by pure, unfiltered bewilderment. You're going to want to see this. The interior of the mill looked like the aftermath of a localized hurricane. Rusted catwalks were twisted and collapsed. A destroyed Bearcat armored vehicle smoldered in the center of the room, its heavy doors blown outward. And everywhere they looked, there were bodies. Men wearing state-of-the-art tactical gear, carrying suppressed HK-416s, lying dead in the sawdust. Some had been dropped with precise, double-tap gunshot wounds. Others bore the brutal, intimate marks of close-quarters knife combat. Who hit this place? A young FBI operator whispered, staring at a mercenary whose cervical spine had been snapped like a dried twig. Was Delta Force in the area? Nobody was in the area. The team leader replied, his eyes tracing the tactical brilliance of the kill zone. Whoever did this was already inside. The beam of his flashlight finally swept toward the back of the warehouse, illuminating the dented, bullet-scarred yellow school bus. The folding doors had been ripped completely off their hinges. Sitting on the bottom step of the bus, illuminated by the harsh glare of tactical lights, was a woman. She was wearing a cheap, blood-stained gray sweatshirt and sweatpants. Her hair was matted with sweat and sawdust. A deep, ugly graze bled freely down her left bicep. In her lap lay a customized Glock 43X. Its slide locked back, empty. Next to her, clinging to her side like a barnacle, was a little boy in a neon green dinosaur t-shirt. FBI, drop the weapon, the team leader shouted, though instinct told him this woman was not the threat. Janet Walker didn't flinch. She slowly raised her hands, deliberately keeping them empty, and kicked the empty Glock away with the heel of her boot. She looked at the heavily armed men surrounding her with the weary, hollow eyes of a veteran who had seen the end of the world and fought her way back. The hostiles are neutralized, Janet said, her voice raspy from smoke but perfectly calm. The children are safe. We have 34 unharmed third graders. One concussed bus driver outside. And a teacher who needs medical attention for shock. The HRT operators exchanged stunned glances. One woman, one suburban mother had dismantled a Tier 1 hit squad. Within 20 minutes, the warehouse was swarming with paramedics, local police, and federal agents. The children were being escorted out one by one, wrapped in foil thermal blankets. They were crying, but they were alive. Mr. Harrison was loaded onto a stretcher, still shaking, but he managed to look at Janet as they wheeled him past. "You saved them," he whispered. "You saved all of us." Janet just offered a tired, tight-lipped smile and a nod. She sat on the tailgate of an ambulance while a young paramedic stitched the graze on her arm. Henry was sitting next to her, drinking a juice box, his legs swinging. "Mom?" Henry asked, looking at the army of police officers cataloging the bodies. "If that was a drill, why are the real police here?" Janet paused. She looked at her son, knowing she couldn't protect him from the reality of the world forever. But she could protect him today. Because, Hank, you and your friends did such a good job playing the game. The police wanted to come and give out the awards. Henry's eyes lit up, the terror of the past 2 hours finally fading into the resilient innocence of childhood. "Really? Do I get a medal?" "You get the biggest one," Janet said, pulling him close. The heavy thwip 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 of rotor blades drowned out the sirens. A sleek, black UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter descended into the clearing outside the mill. Before the skids even touched the ground, a tall, imposing man in a tailored charcoal suit leapt out, flanked by Secret Service agents. Thomas Vance, the Secretary of Defense, ran past the barricades, his composure entirely shattered. "Leo, where is my son?" "Dad." Little Leo Vance broke away from a paramedic and ran into his father's arms. The Secretary of Defense fell to his knees in the dirt, burying his face in his son's shoulder, weeping openly in front of 100 law enforcement officers. Janet watched the reunion from the ambulance tailgate. The cold, mechanical part of her brain registered the success of the mission. Package secured. No friendly casualties. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. Standing before her was an older man in a nondescript trench coat. He didn't wear an FBI windbreaker or police tactical gear. He wore the quiet, invisible authority of the intelligence community. His eyes were cold, analytical, and locked directly onto Janet. "The local PD thinks you're a miracle," the man said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the noise of the staging area. "A heroic soccer mom who got lucky." "I am a mother," Janet replied, her posture shifting imperceptibly, the muscles in her legs coiled, ready for a fight, despite her exhaustion. "And I did get lucky." The man looked at the burning wreckage of the Bearcat, then at the dead mercenary being zipped into a body bag, a thermobaric trap using sawdust, a close-quarters knife kill through the popliteal artery, and a perfectly cooked M67 fragmentation grenade banked off an I-beam. The man turned his gaze back to Janet, pulling a silver Zippo lighter from his pocket and flipping it open. "That isn't luck, Mrs. Walker. That's the textbook doctrine of the task force we formally disbanded in Damascus 3 years ago." Janet said nothing. Her eyes went dead, the maternal warmth vanishing entirely. "You were supposed to be a ghost, Janet," the man whispered. "I was," she replied softly, "until someone decided to bring a war to my son's field trip." "The men you killed today, they weren't random," the man said, lowering his voice further. "They were hired by someone inside the Pentagon. Someone who wanted Vance to step down. And used his son as leverage. You didn't just stop a kidnapping today, Janet. You kicked a hornet's nest. And the people who hired these men now know that a Tier 1 operator is living quietly in the suburbs of Virginia." Janet stood up from the ambulance tailgate. She ignored the pain in her ribs and stood shoulder to shoulder with the intelligence officer. She looked at Henry, who was laughing with a paramedic, holding his juice box like a trophy. "Tell the Hornets," Janet whispered, her voice laced with absolute, chilling certainty, "that if they ever come near my son again, I won't just burn their nest. I'll burn the whole damn forest down." She turned her back on the man, walking toward Henry, the flashing red and blue lights casting long, flickering shadows behind her. The chaperone was going home. But the war had just begun.